A few statistics I think might help frame tonight's discussion. The majority, that is 84% of US adults, say they've taken at least one precaution to protect themselves or their families from the possibility of gun violence. 58% have talked to their kids or other family members about gun safety. 41% have attended a gun safety class or practiced shooting a gun. And 1 in 3 American adults personally own a gun. That is according to Gallup, October of 2022. So those are some current stats. We don't know the exact number of gun owners in Tennessee because in this state we do not require registration, but polls and indicating data show that about 47 to 51%, or about half of Tennesseans, do have firearms in their households. And according to the CDC, firearms are now the leading cause of death for American children and teens ages 1 to 19. That's surpassing motor vehicle accidents and those caused by other injuries. And that data is from 2020. First, I want to ask each member of the panel to introduce yourself, share a bit about what brought you to sit on this panel tonight and answer some tough questions. And why does this matter to you personally? Don, let's begin with you.
Hi, friends. I'm a longtime member of Brentwood United Methodist Church. It's great to see so many familiar faces here in the audience this evening. And my friend Demetria here. Many of you may not know that Demetria was present for my daughter Emily's baptism. She's now 26 years old and stood up in front and witnessed the baptism. I am the Public Affairs Director of the Nashville Police Department. I've been doing this job for 32 years. I have been fortunate to work with a number of chiefs of police who have been just fantastic persons who kind of allow us to do the job we need to do in imparting information to our community. As to why I'm here tonight, I want to tell you a story. On Saturday morning, I went to Edge Hill Memorial Park for a service of remembrance for Jillian Ludwig. She was an 18-year-old Belmont University student who last November 7th was walking on a track in Edge Hill Memorial Park when a gunshot was fired across the way in Edge Hill Public Housing. The person who fired that shot was shooting at a car, but one of his errant rounds went into the park, struck Jillian in the head, dropped her right there on the track, and she was found by another passerby sometime later. She died at Vanderbilt. I was there that night, and I felt a calling to go to the park on Saturday morning. As I was walking into the park, there was an elderly African-American woman, an Edge Hill resident, who was walking into the park ahead of me. She was walking with a cane. Another lady who knew her was behind and asked her, "Where are you going?" And her response was, "I'm going to the park because that mama is still suffering." And of course, the Ludwig family was there on Saturday morning. So that's why I'm here.
Pastor?
My name is Davis Chappell, and I'm privileged to be one of the pastors here. My wife and I have been in ministry for 41 plus years. Last year, we baptized 60 babies in the life of this church and did 60 funerals. I'm approaching this tonight not only as a pastor, but as a grandfather. My church gets regularly tired of hearing about my grandchildren, but we have 2 grandsons, 2.5 and 4 months old. It's a very personal situation for us when it's your own kids. And in those 41 years of ministry, we have suffered with victims of violent crime, with families who have gone through suicides, and the pain of that is unforgettable. You don't forget the faces, the names, and the suffering of those folks. And so much of the suffering that we're seeing is so unnecessary, and something can be done about it. I remember after the Covenant shooting, preaching a sermon where I had heard that someone had said, I don't even, it was one of the politicians that said, there's really nothing that we can do about this. And I remember saying in my sermon that day, I'm so glad that Dr. King didn't look at racism and say, there's really nothing we can do about this. I'm so grateful that Jesus didn't look upon a sinful world and say, there's really nothing that I can do about this. There is something that we can do about this. And I really appreciate the non-partisanship of this. I think it's critical. And the truth is, I think by most stats that we see about probably 90% of folks agree that there has to be some move, some mobilization, some compromise. Another thing that's very encouraging to me is that we can have a dialogue about some difficult issues. And Brentwood United Methodist Church is becoming better about that. We've talked recently about the Middle East conflict with folks from the Middle East. We've had Raising Faith here. We say if there's something that people have a hard time talking about it, we need to talk about it inside the church, not just in the parking lot or at the restaurant or at the bar or wherever that happens. And so we feel like it's critical theologically for people of faith, communities of faith, to be willing to have difficult conversations and to be willing to say, I'm not always right about this. And we can find a way through, a compromise in some way that I think could honor God and could honor our children. Also, we're in the process of building children's space here in the future. So kids are very important to us. Particularly, in our county, 0 to 17 is the second largest demographic. People are here, oftentimes for education in school. Kids are very, very important to us. From their baptism, from their conception to birth to baptism, confirmation, all the way to the eulogy someday that we share with them. So that's why I'm here as a pastor, as a grandfather, and partly as a theologian too.
Dr. Rayford.
Thanks. I'm Dave Rayford, and I was grateful to be invited to be a part of this panel tonight. And I retired last year after 30 plus years at Brentwood University Medical Center, the last 9 of which I was the chief of staff for the medical system as a whole. I felt called to be a participant here to maybe share some experiences and observations with this group that might be complementary to the things that we read in the paper and that make the news about one aspect of this problem related to mental health issues. Don is better schooled than I on the legal ramifications, and he'll share that with you. But I hope I can plant some ideas in the minds of this wonderful group of people who are turned out tonight to think of this problem from the medical side, analogous to the way that we've managed other public health concerns related to medical and mental health illnesses. The last thing I need to state is I have an obligation to say as a disclaimer that anything I offer tonight are my opinions and not be construed as those of Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Thanks.
Erin.
Hey everyone, I'm Erin Rogas. I'm the Policy Director for Voices for a Safer Tennessee. And I also wear a second hat as Policy Advisor for former Senator Bill Frist, who does serve on the Advisory Board of Safer Tennessee. And I'm really engaged in this work because I'm a mom of 3. I have kids actually right here in this neighborhood. My daughter goes to Scales, and I have 2 young kids here in daycare right around the corner. And I have also worked in Republican politics kind of my whole career, including previously for a Republican member in Congress. I led his firearm safety efforts there. We were really, devastated we weren't able to get some changes made then at the federal level when we were starting to see these increases in mass shootings. But I've been really heartened by the work with Voices for a Safer Tennessee because I do feel that we are at a tipping point for change. And we're going to share a little bit more tonight about some of the progress and the hope that we're seeing here. And so grateful to see so many here in the community concerned about this issue. So thank you all for being here tonight.
Erin, I'm going to begin with you. Tennessee has the 9th highest rate of gun violence in the entire nation. And the most recent statewide survey shows that 75% of Tennessee voters support what are called temporary transfer laws that temporarily restrict access to guns for individuals who are at high risk of harming themselves or others. So, why hasn't anything happened in the legislature if the people say they want it?
It's a great question. And it's a question I get asked a lot. I mean, we are truly in the midst of a public health crisis when it comes to firearm injury and death. But as I said, I believe we are actually at a tipping point, that we see reason for hope. I mentioned I worked on this issue in Congress, so I was there in 2012 when the Sandy Hook school shooting happened. And our hearts stopped in that moment. We truly thought we were going to see some change finally happen. Our universal background check bill that the member I worked for had authored, we thought that was going to pass. And we were really shocked when nothing happened. Fast forward 10 years, we continue to see these tragic mass violence events continue to occur. But then in 2022, you had the Uvalde school shooting happen, and voters really then said they had enough. And you actually saw Republicans and Democrats from both sides of the aisle, actually led by a Republican senator from Texas. They came together and passed the most significant piece of federal firearms legislation we've seen in nearly 30 years. It was the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Did it solve all our problems? Certainly not, but it was a step forward. Last year, we obviously had the tragedy at the Covenant School. And Governor Lee, who is one of our strongest Second Amendment governors that we've ever had, he paused and said, it's time to do something different. He proposed an border protection law. When that didn't pass, he called legislators back to have a special session on public safety, and we got some incremental change done then. And now at Safer Tennessee, we are continuing to have really productive conversations with members of the legislature about firearm safety efforts. And I can share more later about some of the bills that we're actually seeing advance that will make a difference, incremental steps on firearm safety for our longer term goals. So we are actually beginning to see progress. And so I do want to share that message because I know it can be such a hard topic to talk about when we feel like nothing is happening. But change is occurring. It's just we need to be patient with the kind of incremental building block steps that are going to allow us to see this longer term change of things like universal background checks and secure storage of firearms and the temporary transfer withdrawal laws that you mentioned, Demetria.
In law in Tennessee. Don, you've seen a lot of changes over your career when it comes to gun-related crimes, and it's really no secret that we had two major inflection points with the legalization of guns in trunks more than a decade ago. That was 2013. And permitless carry in 2021. So what have you seen happening? The numbers would suggest a marked acceleration in these crimes. Does it compute?
Let me go back to the Jillian Ludwig matter for a moment if I can. The man responsible for firing the shot that killed her had been found mentally incompetent to stand trial on aggravated assault cases. He had been arrested in 2021 for shooting at a car that contained a woman and two juveniles. By the time that case made it to court in 2023, he was found mentally incompetent, and what happened then? He was released back onto the streets. Nothing happened in that case. Fast forward to September of 2023. Just last September, the Nashville Police Department arrested him for being in a pickup truck that had been carjacked. September of 2023. He didn't admit to the carjacking, but we charged him then with being in possession of a stolen vehicle. He bonded out a $20,000 bond. On November 7th of last year, he was shooting at that car, and one of his bullets hit Jillian Ludwig. You ask, where did he get the gun? Well, in an interview with our detectives after he was arrested, he said that he came off the streets, that he got the gun off the streets. Where's the gun right now? We have no idea. He said that in the hour, probably 3 hours that went by after the shooting, before we were able to apprehend him, he passed the gun off to somebody else. Now, once we get that gun, we can do some microscopic analysis on the shell casings and the bullets, and we can link that gun back to other crimes. I said to someone just last week that if guns could tell a story, what a story guns would tell. Because this man had a gun, we don't know who gave it to him, how he acquired it, but it's still on the streets today somewhere. I want to move to a more recent event. Well, as far as the Ludwig matter, the legislature just last night passed Jillian's Law, so that now, from henceforth, if a person is found mentally incompetent to stand trial, there is a mandatory transference to a mental institution. There is a mandatory commitment. It's not just opening up the door and letting the person walk out. That's a great thing for Tennessee. That from henceforth, anyone found mentally incompetent to stand trial for a felony goes to a mental institution for treatment. And when the person is found competent, they can stand trial. If the courts deem that he needs to go out into the community after a long period of time, there's still a method to keep track of that individual with community treatment. Just last Sunday morning at 2 a.m., when all of us were asleep, my police officers were on Murfreesboro Pike. They had answered a call of people fighting with guns, armed people fighting. They were very close at that scene on Murfreesboro Pike and Bell Road, and you'll see 1 minute's worth of video of what they saw. And this is real life stuff. This is happening in our community. So that was Sunday morning, just a few miles from here, at Murfreesboro Pike and Bell Road. So this man who was firing the shots left 6 individuals wounded, a couple of them critically, but they're going to survive. As we chased him across the street, and he's in custody right now, he's in jail. He is a convicted felon who at the time of this shooting was free on a $50,000 bond for another reckless endangerment gun crime. We in the police department would say that among the things that we all must do, we've got to keep public safety in mind, and we have to look at these individuals who are victimizing our community repeatedly, and do something. Easter afternoon, you all heard about the shooting at the Roasted Restaurant in North Nashville. A man inside the restaurant got into some silly dispute and started shooting. That individual was a convicted felon. He had aggravated assault convictions here in Nashville. Last August in Murfreesboro, he was arrested for aggravated assault and unlawful gun possession by a convicted felon. August of 2023, he bonded out. Last Halloween, October 31st, 2023, he's arrested for felony drug possession. He bonded out. Fast forward to Easter Sunday, he's in Nashville with a gun that he should never have. And he's shooting people. he's getting to an argument, and he's shooting people. I shake my head every day. I still shake my head at things I hear. And I hear a lot more than you do.
Is there no way, Don, to connect the dots before? I mean, afterwards, we're listening to all the things that these people have done and the early release and bonding out and that sort of thing. Is the information not there on the judge's bench to be able to do that deep dive?
Well, an individual's prior arrest history, conviction history is certainly on a computer that could be seen. There has been some movement in recent times toward early release, bail reform. There was a police officer shot and killed last Friday morning in Memphis, Tennessee. The defendant, accused of shooting and killing that police officer, had been arrested just a few months prior for being in a stolen car with a handgun that had a switch. Now, a handgun switch makes the pistol fully automatic, like a machine gun. So he had a machine gun and was in a stolen car. The judicial commissioner in Memphis, R.O. Ward, that man, released on his own recognizance. Last Friday morning, he uses another gun with a switch, which is a violation of both state and federal law. Having a machine gun is a violation of federal law. He's got a switch with a pistol last Friday morning, and he shot and killed a Memphis police officer. We need to start going back toward looking very closely at people's records and those who have shown a propensity for being a danger to the community, a danger to public safety. We need to think about what needs to happen as far as pretrial confinement, significant pretrial release conditions, not just letting people out.
I want to get back to, when we come around the second round, I want to talk about guns being stolen from vehicles, because you put out releases every day about that. Dr. Rayford, you've seen the impact of gun violence, of course, through the lens.
I think that it's evident to all who are here and to the larger community that the incidence of firearm violence is going up. Those who were impacted as victims and the families and friends of victims know how personally tragic and heart-wrenching this is. I'd ask you to also think and keep in mind the people who staff the trauma centers in the big urban hospitals who see this stuff every day. Because the emotional toll, Don mentioned, never getting hardened to this kind of tragedy. That requires intentionality for a group of people who show up to do work that's very difficult to do. Sometimes not being able to render assistance that might be life-saving or life-extending. I think that it's well for us to know as we think about measures that might come under good discussion by reasonable people who are fair-minded, that the intersection of medical privacy and public health is a path that's been blazed already. We have instances where the personal health issue of an individual is deemed to be a public safety concern. For example, there are laws in this state, and I think every state, that persons who are newly diagnosed with epilepsy or newly requiring insulin-dependent diabetes or other conditions are restricted from operating motor vehicles for 6 months until there can be good control and demonstration that the risk of a lapse of consciousness while driving down the street is diminished and under a reasonable degree of control. Similarly, when by law in the state of Tennessee, when a caregiver makes a diagnosis of certain infectious transmissible diseases that represent a public safety concern, the patients, by law, have to be informed that they will be reported to the public health department. Think of conditions like tuberculosis, hepatitis, etc. And the reason for those controls and the breach of privacy, if you will, which I want to emphasize, caregivers take that very seriously. I would hazard a guess that there's no one in the room who would like their medical history a matter of public record. But in those instances, treatment is ensured so that the risk of being in an elevator or walking in a fitting room at the mall with someone who can cough and give you a bad health problem is deemed to trump that person's right to privacy for a defined period of time. I think similarly, the stigma that's attached to mental health makes it a more complicated problem, because it's well to understand that it's a very small proportion of persons who are under treatment for important mental health diseases who pose a risk to other people, a very small proportion. And so any discussion about setting a criterion or set of criteria by which persons diagnosed with important and potentially dangerous mental health conditions, paranoid schizophrenia, delusional disorders, etc., how they are identified, how they are validated to have a condition that places some degree of public risk, which is measurable in the aggregate, but not confidently predictable in the individual instance. And then defining a process that's fair-minded to bring the problem that this individual and household members are facing into a public health context that is sensible, defensible, and has the greatest amount of respect for privacy for the vast majority of persons who don't pose a danger to the community at large. A pathway which has been established in other instances is for someone to voice a concern. Sometimes it's the patient with a mental health disorder that says, I'm not sure I can control myself. Sometimes it's a family member or a close friend. Well, hopefully that results in a presentation for an assessment by a person qualified to render assistance and make professional judgments about the perceived level of risk. In Tennessee, we have a safety, public safety rule that a licensed physician can commit someone to involuntary hospitalization for 48 hours over their objection, if that physician thinks that they pose a danger to self or others. That's only for 48 hours, and after that, a review has to be made by an administrative judge about whether that involuntary hospitalization can be continued or not. So that there's a sequence of processes which give people the opportunity to have expert input, to have their privacy and their autonomy as individuals respected. Someone's concerned, maybe more than one person is concerned, someone who's qualified to form judgments is entrusted to form judgments, makes a recommendation to an appropriate authority, be that the law enforcement in some instances, be that a judge in the involuntary commitment example. So I think these are paradigms that if good-hearted people who are concerned about all the issues I've mentioned and trying to find the right balance can be in dialogue with people who make laws and sign laws, I think we can make some progress here by not recreating this wheel from the outset.
And I might add that what the doctor's saying is backed by data. Research has shown that only about 4% of community violence is attributable to severe mental disorders. So Aaron, let's stay on the topic of mental health for a minute. The uptick in deaths from firearms is often blamed on our nation's current mental health crisis. After any mass shooting, you hear inevitably, we've got to do something, we need more mental health funding, etc. Is that a fair assessment and a good approach?
Sure, so we certainly are also in the midst of a mental health crisis in our nation as well. But what most people maybe don't realize is that the majority of firearm deaths in our state and our nation, 54% are actually firearm suicides. And we do know there are actually policies that we can put in place to reduce the likelihood of that occurring. And unfortunately, when an individual does commit suicide or attempt with a firearm, there's a 90% completion rate, where with any other sort of method is only about 10%. So when you have access to a firearm, when you are in that state, it increases your likelihood of completion at a much higher rate. So one of the things that Safe for Tennessee is advocating for that would help reduce these deaths is a temporary transfer law, which when an individual is in a period of crisis, when they have made threats either against themselves or their community or others, that they could actually remove the firearms from their possession through due process, through a court-ordered process, for a temporary period of time. So an individual can get treatment. They can actually avoid the worst case scenario. And these laws have been shown to reduce suicides by as much as 13 to 14% in some states. And they've also been shown to be effective in intervening in threats of mass violence. In about 6 states, we've seen they've been used in about 10% of all cases of reported temporary transfer laws. It was for these mass violence threats. So there is an effective approach here that we can do. One of the challenges we've had in our state is that we have over time increased access for individuals who should not have access. So our 2013 Guns and Trunks laws, which allows individuals to now store their firearms in their cars, unoccupied vehicles. In 2013, when that passed, we had reported only about 50 guns stolen from cars statewide. Fast forward 10 years, in 2022, we had over 5,000 guns stolen annually from cars. And so those guns are falling directly into the hands of criminals, into some of the individuals that Don Aaron has mentioned, into their hands. And in that same period, we've seen that acts of violence using firearms against individuals double in our state. So we do know now that folks who are with criminal intent, who are mentally unwell, are increasingly getting firearms in their hands, and it is resulting in these tragedies that we are increasingly hearing about.
Aaron, I would just chime in.
That in Tennessee, as it is true nationwide, there is a harsh shortage of inpatient mental health facilities, not just to care for persons in the group that we're talking about tonight, but persons who have major mental health issues that require hospitalization. The backlog to get to people who need urgent inpatient care is unacceptably high in my opinion. And it's going to require public funding to solve that problem.
Is there any hope that things will change? How involved should churches be? And I guess, cut to the chase, WWJD, what would you say? If you may speak on this.
I'm very careful about saying this is what I think, this is not what Jesus would say. I think it was 2019, it was pre-COVID, we had a training in this very room. I'm sorry, now, can you hear me?
Can we hear me?
Yeah, okay. We had a training in this very room, I think it's 2019, on how to interrupt a mass shooting. So we had 2 different nights where this was happening, and we had probably 400 people in those 2 nights that came, and we learned to throw hymn books at someone or anything you could do to interrupt something. And I realized, when I started ministry in 1983, the last thing on my mind was security. You never thought of it. You didn't think about it so much in the schools. A gun in the school was like nobody ever thought of that. And so I realized at that point, this is a new day. But what we're doing is just reacting to a crisis. That's not going to be enough. There has to be proaction to a crisis, preventative measures. And I read an article today, and I think one of our members sent me an article from the Wall Street Journal that was suggesting that there is a correlation between the decline in community, specifically in faith community, and decline in mental health. And often that leads to violence. I think that's accurate. I shared this with a friend earlier, and they said, well, that depends on what church you go to. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's true. But I think we are living in such a polarization where it's easier to live in isolation than to risk living in relationship, in community with others. Because the church is messed up too. The church is not perfect. The church is a collection of sinners who are seeking Jesus. And we see folks all the time who have specific, huge needs, and that's what we want. The church is a place of grace that is here to reach all people. Now, one of the difficulties of that is when you're a gracious place, sometimes you have interesting things that happen along the way. We don't want to change the grace for all people, But we have a budget for security now. Our security is here, and he's watching you. But that's not enough. There has to be a holistic approach to this. Now, here we have, in the name of Jesus, we have counseling, we have congregational care, we have Stephen ministers, we have spiritual direction, we have a Center for Spiritual Life and Leadership. So we try to address as much as we can. But there has to be a more holistic approach, I think, where faith communities are more proactive in not just what we're doing in Williamson County or at 309 Franklin Road, but what we're doing in terms of the city and the state and with our officials as well. As to what Jesus would do, I would go back to theological issues about this. You could start in the Old Testament with Cain and Abel and what happens when a brother murders his brother. Which begins this whole cycle of violence in the Old Testament. And then you could look at one of the commandments is thou shalt not kill. And we typically would put that in the positive. Thou shalt not kill means also thou shalt give life. Do what helps to give life. I remember years ago hearing people say, well, the Bible says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, right? And said, yeah, but that wasn't an effort to increase violence, that was to inhibit violence. In other words, if Doug were to knock my eye out, I might take his arm off. And it's like, no, let's restrict it to what he did to you. In a primitive culture, that was a way to inhibit continued violence. And then Jesus comes along, and he takes the law, and he reinterprets the law. And he said, wait a minute, the law says thou shalt not kill. But I say to you, if you're angry with your brother or sister, you're already guilty of sin. So there's this inner thing that happens not only individually, but in a culture that's so isolated and polarized that there's this anger within our culture because we lack maybe a sense of community, we're in isolation, and that's a spiritual issue. In the church, we talk about Jesus being the Prince of Peace, right? We're in the Easter season, and the first thing Jesus said when he resurrected from the dead, he came to his disciples and said, Shalom, peace be with you. And then he showed them his scars. He didn't go after the Roman government for it. He didn't go after the religious establishment that put him on the tree. There was a sense of peace and forgiveness in the midst of that. That's a part of our DNA as a church. And so we want to be as gracious as we can. But I think it's important not only to be gracious to sinners, but to recognize their victims as well. And to do all that we can. When the covenant situation happened, one of the things that we did, because we felt like this is a way of responding in a Christ-like way. And most of our heroes are people like Dr. King and Gandhi and others who responded with nonviolence. Jesus said, he who lives by the sword dies by the sword. And that's a pretty important statement to us. When covenant happened, we challenged people not only to write letters to representatives and governor. We supplied letters. Here's a way to write a letter. Literally hundreds of letters. But we also sent letters to the covenant families as well. And one of our pastors delivered those to the teachers and the families as well. It's important to remember while we're also trying to be holistic about how does gospel and law work together in certain ways. But then how do we take care of victims as well? One of the things I'll always remember is when the Emmanuel St. Main Church happened, the shooting in 2015 in Charleston. One of our staff people who was head of our missions was a guy from Africa. And he volunteered for us and we sent not only letters, but we sent prayer shawls that women in the church had made to send to those families by name to let them know that they were remembered. That is critical for the church community, for the faith community. Even if it's someone in Buffalo, or if it's someone at Covenant or Antioch Church when that happened. But I think this is in the name of Jesus that we're called to not only work holistically, spiritual and law, but also to remember the victims and do everything we can to bring a sense of healing and hope
to them as well, in Christ's name.
I want to get to some of the audience questions because they, of course, are better than any I can pose. But Don, you've got stats here on guns stolen from motor vehicles.
So some years ago, we in our department noticed that guns being stolen from vehicles began to tick up. So over the past several years, every week, we announced to our community the number of guns that were stolen from vehicles the prior week. And yes, the TV stations have picked it up, and the TV stations often report on it every week. So in 2014, 10 years ago, 266 guns were stolen from cars in Nashville. 266 in 2014. In 2022, the total was 1,403, 1,403 guns stolen from cars alone in Nashville. We have been reminding people of parking smart, storing your valuables, storing your guns, being safe with firearms. Perhaps it's beginning to resound. In 2023, the number went down from 1,400 to 1,200. So we're beginning to see a slight reduction after many years of increases, year to year. You all have seen the video, the Ring video of young people at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning running through neighborhoods, pulling on door handles to see what's there. I can't believe the number of Nashvillians who are leaving laptops, cash, and even guns in unlocked cars in their driveways. I hope that's stopped or beginning to stop, but I think the message has started to resound. We just have to keep it up and ensure that it stays that
Do
way.
you think anything meaningful will happen during this session? And I want to hit an audience question here. Does or is Voices for a Safer Tennessee endorsing or planning on endorsing federal or state candidates based on their firearm positions?
Great. Thank you, Demetria. So I'm going to share a quote quickly from my boss, Senator Frist, on kind of what he thinks about with legislative change. It's actually a quote he takes from Albert Einstein. And he said, "The most powerful force in the universe is compound interest." And what does that mean? That means every year, if we make small, seemingly insignificant changes, year after year, those actually build up and have a cumulative impact. The statistics that Don just shared about guns being stolen in cars, that changed because of in part, a 2013 law that allowed us to now store our firearms in our cars with the positive intention of letting people be safe when they're driving to work, being able to have their firearm on their person, store it in their vehicle when they go into work. But now we have individuals who they're leaving it in their car unlocked. Folks are checking those doors and stealing them, and now they're falling into criminal intent. So these policy changes do have an impact that we may not be thinking about when we're passing them at the time. And so what could happen this session that could be potentially meaningful? A few things. So one of the things that State of Tennessee strongly supports is background checks on every firearm transaction. But our background check system, we found, needs to be strengthened. We have a 761,000 record backlog in our background check system. So that means there are individuals who probably have committed a felony or other crimes, and when they go to purchase firearm legally, they may not actually, that record may not actually pop up. So the governor, we advocated for this, and the governor included funding in his budget for that to help address that backlog, which we're really grateful for. Another piece, Jillian's Law, which Don mentioned, and he said passed on Monday night. We're really excited about that piece of legislation. I would make those deemed incompetent to stand trial prohibited from purchasing firearms. Another piece of legislation that is moving through the process that has really potential to be some of the most significant legislation to prevent juvenile crime and young adult crime, HB 1600. If you want to let your lawmakers know that you really support this bill, we would appreciate that. This bill would make those who are under 25, who have juvenile violent criminal histories or juvenile mental health adjudications, it would make them prohibited purchasers of firearms until age 25. And so this is important because we know ages 18 to 20, that's the age that you are most likely, that is at highest risk of committing a firearm homicide. And this youth age is also higher risk for firearm suicide as well. So this could have a meaningful impact on firearm-related crime. And honestly, a lot of this is also playing defense. There are also some bad bills out there, including legislation that we have, helped kill that would have allowed for carrying in posted places of business. So kind of directly at odds with your private property rights there. And there's another piece of concerning legislation that's still before the legislature now. Again, if you are interested in weighing in on these issues, we ask you to contact your legislator. Most of you all, if you live nearby, it's probably Representative Gino Bolso and Senator Jack Johnson. And it's SB 2502. This bill would allow the permitless carry of loaded long guns, just for those 18 and older. So you would be able to essentially carry a loaded semi-automatic rifle down Main Street if this passed. So we are advocating strongly against that bill, and so there are some good pieces that could move forward, but there's also some concerning pieces that we're here to work on.
So law enforcement in Tennessee is actually opposed to that long gun bill. The Tennessee Association. The Tennessee Association of Chiefs of Police has called members to be present for committee hearings. There's just a number of things that could go wrong with this. So law enforcement in the state is large.
Here I am holding a card that says, as a Covenant mom, I'm very concerned about HB 1005, letting people carry large firearms and lowering the carry age to 18. So glad we addressed that. We're going to be opposed, and indeed they are. A few things that Voices for Safer Tennessee supports, and I want to take each of your temperatures on these. Enacting temporary transfer laws for people showing elevated risk of harming themselves or others. Implementing stronger storage laws that require firearm owners to provide secure storage and report lost or stolen weapons. Apply consistent background check requirements across more firearm transactions. Will those all sound like good ideas to you all?
Yeah,
I think they do, and I want to circle back to the mechanisms that are in place for managing other health-related public threats. And the success of any endeavor that involves human beings is going to be imperfect because we all have strengths and we all have shortcomings. But when those measures are successful, it's a partnership between the affected individual, the people who love that person, household members and friends, and a state regulatory governmental agency or law enforcement. So I think if we are to have temporary transfer denial based on mental health issues, the success of that is going to have to come from a carefully cobbled together plan and the courage of individuals who care about people with mental health to gently but courageously inquire. It's likely that everyone in this room knows someone who's close to someone or has had in the past an experience with a friend or family member who had important mental illness. Having the courage to ask in an appropriate setting with the relationship capital that's inherent in a family or a close friendship to say, do you have access to firearms? Or do we have firearms in our home? If so, are they secured so that they're not accessible by the person who's at some risk for self-harm or possibly harming others? It's analogous to hiding the car keys. It's not complicated, but it requires the courage of relationship capital to ask those tough questions because those questions might not be received favorably in every instance, but I think they need to be asked. And the collective energy of all the people in Tennessee being attentive to that need, the number of tragedies that could be prevented is hard to quantify, but I would suggest that every one is an important one. Thanks.
I like the idea of practicality. Why don't we share some practical things that people in this room and those who might watch the program afterwards can enact on their own?
So how many here are gun owners? How many have firearms? I implore you and your friends who are similar gun owners to treat them as you would cash, your most expensive jewelry. Keep track of those items and keep them safely secured. On the mental health standpoint, we need your help to be our eyes and ears in many cases. You know, we have 1,500 officers in Nashville. We have a population of 700,000 plus. So we need you to be our eyes and ears as to things that you see or things that you hear. If someone is speaking about a threat to a church, to a school, keep your ears open and let us know that. We have a threat assessment team in our police department that works 24/7, that vets these threats. They're very, very good at what they do. And most of the time you never hear what they're doing because they're interceding before anything bad can happen. But a lot of the information we get is coming from people like you because your eyes and ears are open, your head's on a swivel as you go about your day-to-day activities. And if you hear something or see something that concerns you, say something, let us know.
Really vulnerable are children and elderly who may not be able to size up a situation. That extension of care and courage can relate to checking out the circumstances where we may allow our children and grandchildren to go. I think I happen to guess that the majority of gun owners in the room wouldn't be troubled if they said we're having a sleepover for 12-year-olds. Do the host family, are there firearms in the home? If they are they secure? That's a simple question. And in this current era, anyone who, in my opinion, is offended by that question, that's an issue for them to resolve.
I also think some training needs to go along with firearm purchases.
Question there. Has there been much concern in Tennessee that to obtain a gun permit, only watching a video is required instead of actual hands-on training? Is that accurate?
I don't know that.
But if so, is that concerning?
Well, yes. In March of this year, we had a mom who came home. She carried a pistol in her purse that she never used, but she had it for protection. She was in a bad relationship some years ago, and she got home one night, rather late, and her 13-year-old daughter was there to greet mom as she came in. And mom got to fiddling in her purse, and that gun, unholstered, was in her purse. Well, the finger got in the trigger guard, the finger pulled the trigger, the gun went off, the bullet went through the purse into her 13-year-old daughter and killed her. That was in March of this year. So that's why I say training, storage, there are trigger locks. In our police department, you can get a free trigger lock at any of our precincts. Just walk in and ask for one. We can also help you if you ask a police officer on how to safely store your gun or what type of holster to buy for your gun. There are some things that we can do to help one another prevent tragedies like that.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, we are unfortunately number 3 in the nation for accidental shootings by children. So that does mean kids are unfortunately accessing firearms because they aren't being properly secure or stored. And other ways I would just mention that, beyond securely storing your firearms, which is a top priority of ours, other ways that you can get engaged. With Jillian's Law last night, we had volunteers with us on on the Senate gallery, we got to see that law being voted through the Senate. We had volunteers today in the committee hearings that were discussing the long gun bill today. So if this is an issue you feel passionately about and you want to get more engaged, we have opportunities for legislative presence down at the Capitol if you kind of want to see this process happening in real time. It is fascinating. We also really encourage you all to weigh in with your lawmakers. It really does make a difference because we are, I call us the silent majority. The overwhelming majority of Republican voters in the state, we are a Republican supermajority legislature with a Republican governor, but the overwhelming majority of Republican voters in this state support firearm safety laws like universal background checks, secure storage laws, and temporary transfer laws. Those all hold 60 to 80% among Republican primary voters. So we know that the majority of our state wants change, but they need to hear that so that when they are going to cast their vote, they know that their constituents are behind them. And so that really does make a difference. In Tennessee, we are 49th, I believe, in the nation for voter turnout. So we are not doing a great job of showing up at the polls, also to elect these folks that are going to be, sharing our voice. So really encourage them all, not just in the general, really the primaries, the individuals, the senators and representatives down at the Capitol. A lot of them end up winning their elections by a matter of hundreds of votes or less. It's a very small margin, so turnout really makes a difference. And so, and Demetria, I apologize, I failed to answer the question earlier about whether we are going to be getting involved in elections. Say for Tennessee, we have stood up a PAC, but we aren't kind of weighing in on anything political right now. We are focused on the legislative session, but are looking at kind of supporting some of our friendly incumbents who have really been advocates for firearm safety work, and we will be sharing more about this kind of after session as far as what the landscape looks like for the elections and for firearm safety in the state. So please kind of stay tuned. SaferTN.org. We're going to have a newsletter. We have a regular Friday newsletter that shares a lot of this information. We'd love to keep you all updated on these things as they progress.
I think we've got time for one more prepared question, but I did want to share something that we discussed before we came on stage. Someone had mentioned that when their child has a play date at someone's home, they call ahead and ask whether there's a firearm in the house and how it's stored. What a simple idea that could really prevent tragedy. So many great questions, folks, but I think this is actually a good one for everyone to consider. How do we engage with friends who see any conversation about gun safety as an attack on their Second Amendment rights? How do you break that ice without breaking the friendship or the relationship?
I just think that there are certain common sense things that we all can agree on, right? There's a middle ground in some of these issues. As far as securing your valuables when you leave them. What's wrong with that? We all agree to that. The legislation, Jillian's Law, I think the vote in the House was unanimous. There were no votes for that. I mean, there's common ground that we can find, and just talking helps find the common ground.
I tell you, it makes a huge difference when a group of mothers come to see the pastor in November to talk about this night. From in the community, and some of the women who came to talk to us about this in November are a part of this church. It makes a huge difference when moms come and take up the mantle and begin to make a difference. And I think, Aaron, what you're talking about too, it's so critical when you're talking about cultural change that you don't get frustrated that it's not going to happen overnight. What we're trying to do is move the needle. You begin to move the needle and there's some momentum that can happen. But I want to applaud particularly Claudia and Lindsay and these others who are moms who have taken up this mantle, and you all are being heard and you're making a huge difference.
Speaker, I'd like to comment on the Second Amendment question, because I find that when generalizations are thrown out, that it helps to distill, and countering those generalizations, to distill down to some critical points. I don't know anybody who holds that position who would disagree that having legal protections to make it so that persons with violent felony convictions can't have access to guns and be on the streets. I don't know anybody who disagrees with that. And so I think you can deconstruct that generalization by having a cordial conversation and saying, well, what about people who are incapable of self-care? Would you let them fly an airplane with you in it? So I think there are ways to counter those sweeping statements that really are often based on misunderstanding or apprehensions about things that aren't really likely to come to pass in many instances.
And I'll just add that with any right comes responsibilities. And Safer Tennessee is in no way talking about taking away anyone's firearm rights. We support the Second Amendment. We are talking about responsible firearm ownership and putting in place guardrails that will create safer, healthier communities. No one wants this to be the #1 killer of our children. We had a powerful conversation actually when we were in Chattanooga recently for an event, and we were talking with the waitress who had just graduated from high school, and she told us the best part, or well, what she was happy about being done with high school was when she didn't have to worry about being the victim of a school shooting anymore. And the fact that that is something our high school children, any of our children in school, are thinking about regularly, that they're being subjected to these active shooter drills that are, causing a great deal of fear. I don't think any of us want our kids to live through that. So we have to be able to find, I think, a way to improve safety while also maintaining